Welcome back to the Truth Factory. On Monday morning, Donald Trump Jr.'s wife was rushed to a Manhattan hospital after opening an envelope addressed to her husband that had a threatening message attached stating, "You're an awful person and now you'll get what you deserve." This letter also contained a mysterious white powder. Investigators' official story is that the powder in the envelope was cornstarch. Trump Jr. has blamed this attack on someone with opposing political views. So which one of these dickheads do you think did it? If this story sounds familiar, it might be because last week Julian Assange also received an envelope containing a threat and a mysterious white powder. The stamp on his envelope was from the United States, so it's very possible that these two packages came from the same source. And although in these particular cases the powder turned out to be non-hazardous, when I was researching similar instances, it took me down a conspiracy rabbit hole of stories involving the CIA, anthrax, suicide, torture, and cover-ups. I found it to be incredibly interesting, and I thought you might too. So let's go further down this cat tunnel together. Now, for most people, hearing about any white powder in an envelope is reminiscent of the letters that were sent after 9/11 that read, "Death to America, death to Israel, Allah is great." These letters contain the bacteria anthrax and when opened became airborne and deadly. This set off paranoia and terror for anyone who opened mail in the fall of 2001. The antibiotic ciprofloxacin used to combat anthrax was in a higher demand than Viagra at the time.
September 11th, I think it'll come as a shock to a lot of people, but it's been reported by the New York Times and other major news organizations and confirmed by the White House. The President's office and Vice President's office went on Cipro, the antibiotic that was used to combat anthrax. The White House went on Cipro. It must have known that either an attack was underway or was imminent.
But despite the jihadist slogans accompanying the mailed anthrax, this had nothing to do with Osama bin Laden, Saddam Hussein, or any other foreign element. In my opinion, this was one of the biggest botched investigations in American history, and it was bungled by no other than James Comey and Robert Mueller, which doesn't give me a lot of faith in the current FBI system. These anthrax letters were originally pinned on an innocent scientist named Stephen Hatfill, based on no substantial evidence. Hatfill was later exonerated and eventually won millions in a lawsuit against the Department of Justice.
To look my fellow Americans directly in the eye and declare to them, I am not the anthrax killer. I know nothing about the anthrax attacks. I had absolutely nothing to do with this terrible crime.
With Hatfill cleared, the FBI and the DOJ eventually put the sole blame of the anthrax deaths on Dr. Bruce Ivins, who was an American microbiologist and senior biodefense researcher at an Army Medical Research Facility in Fort Detrick, Maryland. And although there was strong circumstantial evidence that Dr. Ivins had made the anthrax, as his job was literally to make anthrax, there was no real motive for him to mail it to those specific targets. Bruce Ivins' writing also did not even come close to a match of the writing on those letters. Dr. Ivins conveniently committed suicide a week before the FBI declared him the lone wolf in these attacks.
Based upon the totality of the evidence we had gathered against him, we are confident that Dr. Ivins was the only person responsible for these attacks.
The FBI connected the letter materials to a particular flask called flask RMR 1029.
A flask that's effectively the murder weapon from which those spores were taken that was controlled by Dr. Ivins. Anthrax in that flask was created by Dr. Ivins.
The scientific link between the letter material and the flask number RMR 1029 is not as conclusive as stated in the DOJ investigative summary.
If it's not the murder weapon, the whole foundation of the case is in jeopardy. Because if that's not the murder weapon, then you have to go back to the beginning and say, well, what was and who had access to that?
We are now beginning the process of concluding this investigation.
Now that the primary suspect was dead, the story died with him and the case was closed. No further arrests were made. Since I think everything surrounding 9/11 is suspicious, this is no exception. And I believe the 5 initial targets of those anthrax letters were not random. These targets included media outlets and politicians who were adversaries to the Bush administration. The media targets included the editor of the New York Post and the photo editor at the National Enquirer. These publications had recently put out multiple salacious stories about George Bush's daughters being party animals at college. This painted the Bush family in a negative light. The third media target was, strangely enough, Tom Brokaw at NBC. Brokaw had previously scheduled the broadcast of an interview with Bill Clinton for September 18th. Senior communications staffers from the White House had allegedly called NBC producers to complain about this interview being aired. But despite those complaints, NBC chose to air this interview anyway. And that week, they just coincidentally became victims of an anthrax letter. The two senators who were meant to receive those letters were Tom Daschle and Patrick Leahy. Patrick Leahy has accused Dick Cheney of profiting off of the war from his ties to Halliburton. In 2004, Dick Cheney even told Leahy on the Senate floor to go f*** himself. As for Tom Daschle, George Bush and Dick Cheney asked Tom repeatedly not to investigate 9/11.
Many times did the Vice President ask you not to investigate this, and have others at the White House also asked that there be no investigation?
Oh, I'm not sure. There were numerous times. I can't recall exactly how many.
I also just want you to clarify Cheney's statement, no investigation whatsoever, not merely a private investigation. I had thought earlier that he wanted to make sure this was kept, private intelligence community investigation.
Well, the impression that the Vice President left with me is that he would prefer no investigation.
Basically, these senators were a thorn in the Bush administration's side. Not only were these letters an attempt to threaten and harm specific people, the anthrax letters also helped to legitimize a politics of hysteria. Since the letters were initially blamed on jihadi terrorists, they helped pave the road to a war with Iraq.
How are things going in Afghanistan now?
I think we're doing fine. I think we'll do fine. The second phase, if I could just make it very quickly, the second phase is Iraq. There is some indication, and I don't have the conclusions, but some of this anthrax may, and I emphasize may, have come from Iraq.
Oh, is that right?
If that may be the case, then that's when some tough decisions are going to have to be made.
Are you now operating on the assumption that the September 11th attacks and the anthrax anthrax letters are linked?
Well, we don't have any hard evidence, but there's no question that anybody who would mail anthrax with the attempt to harm American citizens is a terrorist. And there's no question that Al-Qaeda is a terrorist organization.
But this is where it gets creepy. In 2009, a young U.S. Air National Guard intelligence analyst named Matthew Dehart stumbled upon a big government secret. Matthew was a member of the hacktivist collective known as Anonymous, and he created a repository on the dark web for leaked government files. One day while monitoring the server, he found an unencrypted folder. While reading through these files, he says he discovered what appeared to be hundreds of internal documents from the FBI. This included field notes from the Bureau's investigation into the anthrax-laced letters. The documents revealed that the U.S. Army produced a strain of anthrax that was used in the letter attacks. The report went on to build a case that the CIA was behind the attacks as part of an operation to fuel public terror and build support for the Iraq War. At this point, he got scared that he saw something that he wasn't supposed to and deleted the folder. But first he screenshotted a dozen or so interesting pages which he put on a thumb drive and hid in a gun case. Months later, half a dozen officers stormed into Matthew's house with a search warrant citing suspicion of child pornography. The officers confiscated the family's computers and took electronics. But of course they did not look in his gun case. So after the officers left, Matthew showed his hidden thumb drive to his parents and hinted that he was being framed by the government for harboring state secrets.
Nobody's gonna defend anybody that's charged with child pornography. I'm not saying it's not a problem, because it is a problem. But when they use that as a cover for something else, I mean, it's almost unquestioning. Nobody wants to look at the case. Nobody wants to talk about it in the media. They just want to make it go away. If that involves putting someone in prison or groups of people in prison, well, so what? It's better safe than sorry. I don't have child pornography on my stuff. Didn't have it at the time. Never had it. I wasn't concerned about that. I thought they were going to come back for my thumb drives. From that moment, I knew what they were there for, and they wanted my server, and they wanted information related to Anonymous.
Matthew then encrypted the files and copied them onto a handful of additional thumb drives. He mailed one to a friend outside of London and several others to locations that he refuses to disclose. Matthew unsuccessfully tried to seek asylum through the Russian and Venezuelan embassies. He then moved to Canada but was later detained for questioning. He claims at this point he was drugged and describes the treatment he received as torture. He was taken unconscious in an ambulance from the jail to a medical center where he was diagnosed with a psychotic break.
I remember when he was in Kentucky, one of the inmates who he became friends with had told me once on the phone that Matt had had burn marks when he came in on both sides of his arms, and Matt didn't remember how he got them until he started having nightmares, and his memories started coming back, and they put him in a chair, and they put a bag over his head, and they poured water on him, and they kept tasing him.
Matthew Dehart later said this about his interrogation. They started with people in my military unit, what the connection was between them, me and the Russian embassy, and then started asking me about connections between people in my military unit and Anonymous. They also asked me about WikiLeaks, which makes you wonder, if the real reason that Matthew was detained was for child pornography, why would they be asking him about WikiLeaks? Why was he ambulanced out of the interrogation room unconscious? And where are those encrypted thumb drives today? Julian Assange just commented on Matthew's situation and said that the abuse of law in Dehart's case was obvious, shocking, and wrong. And if Matthew's claims about the 2001 Anthrax letters are real, then the FBI knew when they closed the case that the CIA was really behind the letters and not Dr. Ivins. So what involvement did Bruce Ivins really have, if any? Was he just a patsy, or was he a CIA agent himself who took his secrets to the grave? I ask this question due to the parallels of Dr. Ivins' story to another anthrax scientist linked to the CIA. Nearly 50 years prior, in the exact same location of Fort Detrick, worked Dr. Frank Olson, who was a biological warfare and anthrax expert. He was also a CIA agent. While at Detrick, Dr. Olson was working on an anthrax project. But at the same time, MKUltra research was going on in the same facility. Dr. Frank Olson was being covertly dosed with LSD by his supervisor. At this point, Olson told his wife that he planned to leave the CIA. Shortly after that, Olson plunged to his death from a window of a 13-story New York hotel room, and this was labeled a suicide. In 1994, Dr. Olson's son had his father's body exhumed and had an autopsy performed that showed injuries to his head and chest that had not occurred during the fall. This suggested a homicide. With all of this information linked together, it really makes you question what goes on behind the scenes. Who can we really trust? How many mass cover-ups have taken place and for what cause? Who's really in charge here, and what lengths will they go to keep a secret? Thank you for watching, and thank you for your patience. These type of videos do require a lot of research and time, so I very much appreciate your support. Thank you so much and have a great night. Meow.